the U.S. will immediately send aid from its stockpiles to Ukraine. We don't have a lot of granularity on what that's going to look like. I have heard that Republicans have convinced the White House, theoretically, to send more advanced weapons to Ukraine now that so much time has passed. And among them is ATACMS, which would be a game changer for the field.
The head of NATO says the bloc will give Ukraine more help with air defences, following pleas from President Volodymyr Zelensky. Meanwhile, in the US, the House of Representatives is today due to vote on an aid package for Ukraine, totalling more than $60 billion. Caitlin Doornbos is the Washington reporter for the New York Post.
They are voting on 4 different bills. We had one package sent by the Senate that included aid for Ukraine and for Israel and for Taiwan and fighting in the Indo-Pacific, countering China to that extent. Now they have gone and they've broken it down into 4 different pieces of legislation. Basically, they're going to vote one by one. Do we want to support Ukraine? Yes, no. Do we want to vote to support Israel? And so on and so forth.
Now, since the war began in Ukraine, there's been a lot of support, military and financial support for Ukraine. So for people here in the UK, it can sometimes be a little bit confusing to understand why suddenly, and it feels like suddenly, maybe it's not, there seems to be less support politically from the US. Why is that? What are the arguments for not supporting Ukraine with additional funding?
Frankly, it's not a very common sentiment in the House. There are about 3 people who are against it, being led by one person who is very far right. Marjorie Taylor Greene is her name. She is not a big fan of David Cameron, as if your audience remembers. She is trying to tank this funding. Her rhetoric is that we need to be putting money into America first. She doesn't have a lot of grasp on the foreign policy effects of how Ukraine is affecting the U.S. and how really if Ukraine falls, it will affect the rest of the free world. That's not really what she's paying attention to. She's paying attention to the southern border and a lot of other valid issues that we have in America. But what the majority of the Republican Party is saying is like, no, we still have to address Ukraine and Taiwan and Israel and our southern border. We're the United States of America, and we need to start acting like it.
I have heard some Republicans say, and maybe they are a minority, and I'd be interested to know what you think, who have said, actually, this is Europe's problem to sort out. You know, we've given lots of money, we've given lots of support, but we're a couple of years into the war now. And actually, with the problems that, as you rightly point out, within Israel and the situation with Iran at the moment and in Gaza, that there's other parts of the world that need our attention. Actually, Europe needs to focus on this.
I think it comes from a couple of different standpoints. One is just sheer geography. I will admit myself, I went to Ukraine about 2 months ago to report on the ground of the war there as we were leading up to this big vote. And I realized just how different Europeans see the war versus Americans. And I think it's just geography. Because even to you, just across the pond, as it were, I mean, you're that much closer to Russia and to seeing what would happen if it spills over. I think that is a real reality that Americans they just can't quite put it in the geographic terms to think that, you know, Russia could come into the United States and strike America, which it absolutely could. But I also think that there is some nationalist sentiment among some in the far right that are, again, this America first, really negating out all of the foreign policy focus on building up our foreign relations. These are the followers of, for example, like Donald Trump. He kind of espouses this notion of America first. But I think what we're seeing now with this package, to get it on the floor, it had to have the support of both Republicans and Democrats to get it through. It could not be passed by one side or the other single-handedly. So now we're starting to see some coming together on the issue, and I think hopefully this continues, because what you get when there is so much division is that minority becomes very loud.
So the element of the bill which focuses on aid for Ukraine, is that expected to pass today?
I expect it to. I think just about every reporter here does. And that's because it's got a lot of support in the House. And that's it's got a lot of support, not only among Democrats, but also among Republicans. I think there were 55 Republicans who voted against pushing this up for a vote. Now, that's not that they were against Ukrainian aid per se, but they just didn't want to send the entire package to the floor yet. But I mean, I think that shows that's a strong majority of Republicans who want to see this through. It's also a strong majority of Democrats as well, but there were also a lot of dissenters. I think what will be interesting is watching the Israel aid, because you'll see a lot more Democratic dissenters. And on Ukraine, I mean, I think that's what everybody's really watching, because now putting this up for a vote, Republicans and Democrats alike, everybody has to put their names under, what they voted. They have to say, did you vote to support Ukraine, yes or no? Because they can't blame it on some other issue. Say, for example, if you're voting on a bill that has both Ukraine and Israel aid, you can't say, well, I couldn't vote for it because I support Israel or something like that. So it will be interesting to see, once and for all, you've got to stand up. Yes or no? Do you support Ukraine?
And timeline-wise, if it was to be voted through today, how quickly would the funds be released to Ukraine?
They would be immediately released and probably delivered within 2 to 4 days, some of the first anticipated goods. There's going to be some catch-up that needs to be made, because some of this equipment has to first be made on the assembly lines and things like that. But separately, the U.S. will immediately send aid from its stockpiles to Ukraine. We don't have a lot of granularity on what that's going to look like. I have heard that Republicans have convinced the White House, theoretically, to send more advanced weapons to Ukraine now that so much time has passed. And among them is ATACMS, which would be a game changer for the field.
So that's Caitlin Doornbos, who is Washington reporter for the New York Post. It's going to be really interesting. I mean, $60 billion is not to be sniffed at. And if that goes through, if that gets passed, that could make a huge difference to Ukraine and its ability to fight Russia.
Absolutely vital.